Welcome to Masechet Nedarim. It's perhaps not coincidental that we're starting Masechet Nedarim this year during the week of Parashat Bereshit. And in Parashat Bereshit, of course, we read about the creation of the world. And Mishnah in Masechet Avot tells us, Be'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam, right? There's an emphasis on the fact that the world was created in 10 utterances and 10 sayings. And that's exactly the subject of Masechet Nedarim. All of this Masechet is going to be talking about the significance and the importance of speech. Now, if we think about the story that we read this week about the creation story, then we can notice that there is a distinction between two different kinds of creation in the creation story as a whole. On the one hand, we have the first creation, right? The creation of the light, where the pasuk just says, "Vayomer Elohim yehi or." God said, "Let there be light." V'miyad vahi or, and immediately there was light. So just the utterance of saying, "Let there be light," was enough to create the light. By contrast, the following days, the utterance itself wasn't enough. Okay, we need the utterance plus an action. So for instance, the saying Yehi Rakia is not enough in order to create the Rakia, to create the skies, but there's also a divine action. Vayas Elohim et harakia. So there's speech plus action. So similarly, in Halakha as well, we have many speech acts that are performed together with some kind of an action. Think, for instance, of the Maaseh of Kiddushin, where speech is part of it, but there's also a kinyan, right, of an object that changes hands. That's also part of the Kiddushin, and you need both of those, both the speech and the action. By contrast, certain halachic acts are actually performed only through a speech act. So for instance, if we look at a field and we want to say, okay, this part of the field is now going to be pe'ah, and I, as the owner of the field, am not going to collect this corner, it's enough to just say, this is the area that is pe'ah, okay? And similarly, also with nedarim. Nedarim are an act that is created through speech, okay? What's called in philosophy a speech act, where the actual saying of something creates a new reality. And Nedarim is not the only Masechet which deals with speech acts. Speech acts are also found in a group of Masechtot, which deal with a certain kind of chiyuv. That's not something that's written in the Torah. It's not a mitzvah to take a neder, for instance. Okay, it's not a mitzvah to become a nazir, and we'll talk about that when we get to Masechet Nazir next. But the Torah says that a person can create certain kinds of obligations for him or herself, in addition to the obligations that the Torah already sets out. So the same thing is true also for Nedarim, for Shvuot, for Hekdeshim, for Nezirut. All of these are areas where a person can go above and beyond the regular halakha and create new obligations for oneself. And that's why we'll see that there are many, many connections between these different masechtot. Now, if you think about when we look at the world of the Torah, the world that the Torah lays out, where is speech found in the Torah in a way that it can create a new reality? We find that primarily in the area of korbanot. Okay, in order to dedicate a korban or a mincha, I can take a certain item. I can take some flour, or I can take a sheep, and I say, Harei ze kodesh. This item is now dedicated, is now sanctified. And just by saying that, I've changed the essence of this item, of this material, from chulin to kodesh. So when we think about a neder is actually an expansion of that capacity that we have in the world of korbanot. And a neder expands that capacity to the world of chulin as well. Okay, just as my speech can turn a sheep from chulin into kodesh, in the same way, I can also take that same sheep or that same flour and I can prohibit that item to myself or sometimes to others without making it korban, without making it kodesh. Okay, so that is actually the essence of what a neder is. And the neder is making something prohibited to a certain person or to many people. Now, when we think about nederim in the Torah, we actually have to distinguish between nederim in the Torah and the nederim that we find mostly in our Masechet, because nederim in the Torah are generally what we call nidrei hekadesh, while the nederim that we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud are generally what we call nidrei isar. What is the difference between them? The biblical neder is generally a neder which has some kind of stipulation. So for instance, Yaakov takes a neder that if God will protect him, then he will give a maaser from all of his possessions. Hannah takes a neder that she will dedicate, if God gives her a son, then she will dedicate that son to the mikdash. Okay, or if you think about the neder of the people on the ship in the book of Yonah, okay, they say if God saves us, if God takes care of us, then we will do such and such. By contrast, the nederim in Masechet Nederim are not generally nidrei hekadesh, and they don't necessarily depend on a stipulation. There are cases of stipulation, but often these are nederim that are taken, the background's often unclear, but it seems that often these nederim are taken in a moment of anger. That seems to be the context frequently. And the neder isar is a neder where a person oser, a neder where a person prohibits something upon him or herself. Okay, so when a person prohibits something in this way, okay, let's say I say, I take a neder that that this cup will be prohibited to me. So in general, the terminology that is used for that is to say that this cup will now be like a korban for me. Okay, and therefore what that means is that I can't use this cup anymore because it's as though it was something that is hekdesh. It's as though something that is sacred, and therefore I can't use it anymore. Okay, and therefore the terminology that we find in Masechet Nederim is terminology which is taken from the world of the Mikdash. A stam neder, just a regular neder, is the Mishnah will say it's like a neder, like a korban. And the terminology that we'll actually see, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is terminology which does not necessarily use the word korban, but often uses other terms that are similar to the word korban. So it could be konam or konach. So words that sound like korban, but are not necessarily korban. Okay. Now, in the ancient world, we know that oaths and vows were a significant part of a person's life. We know this from many, many ancient cultures, and it's something that's quite distant from our world. But we have to remember that in the world of the rabbis' halacha, nederim are not a mitzvah. It's not something that a person has to do. It's something that a person takes on themselves voluntarily. However, as soon as a person has taken on this neder voluntarily, then there is an obligation to observe the neder. Okay, the rabbis did not see this idea of taking on nederim as something favorable. You might think, a person wants to take on more kedusha and more more obligations, more prohibitions. This wasn't necessarily something that the rabbis saw favorably. They discussed the pasuk that says, Tov asher lo tidor mishetidor velo teshalem. It's better just not to take any nedarim at all. But if you have taken a neder, then you should make sure to fulfill that neder. And they have many different ideas that they try to describe the difficulty of taking a neder. They say, once you're taking on an extra obligation, then God is going to open his pinkas, his notebook, and any person who takes on a neder, God is going to check what this person is doing and really go into details in how this person is observing halakha and taking on more and more prohibitions. So it seems that Chazal thought that halakha is prohibitive enough. Okay, there's enough things that we can't eat. There are enough behaviors that are forbidden, enough relationships that are forbidden, and there's no need to take on more chumot and more prohibitions. However, we will see sometimes throughout Masechet Nedarim, and we'll see this more in Masechet Nazir as well, that there sometimes is ambivalence or machloket about how to treat all of these kinds of extra prohibitions, because the rabbis did recognize that sometimes this can serve a good purpose, a purpose of extra hitkadshut, an extra attention that a person pays to all of their property, to all of their behaviors, to all of their relationships. Now, in order for neder to take effect, there are certain kinds of conditions. First of all, the most important is that a person has to have intention to take a neder, and therefore there's a lot of significance that's attributed here, both to linguistics and terminology, but also to what should we think about what are our assumptions about the da'at that a person had at a certain moment when a person took a certain neder. So, for instance, if a neder is performed with language that seems, really excessive in a way that doesn't make sense. For instance, the Mishnah talks about someone who took a neder and says, I'm taking this neder if I did not see a snake who is as huge as the beam that is used in making olive oil. Okay, and if you are describing such a huge snake, which no one has ever seen before, then and you're using that for making your neder, then that is going to make the neder invalid, okay, because it's too exaggerated, it's too excessive. Similarly, if it's kind of a neder which is clear that it's just the purpose of the neder is in order to induce someone to do something quickly, okay, so these are nederim that are invalid because it's clear that the kavanah wasn't really significant enough to make the neder valid. Another important condition is that it has to be very, very clear what the person is prohibiting to themselves when they take the neder. And a very, very large part of this masechet deals with all kinds of situations where the neder was taken in an unclear way. Whether it's because the noder didn't finish the neder, okay, and then you can only understand the person's intention out of the context. This is called dot nedarim, okay, so the neder wasn't completed. You just started saying something and didn't complete your neder. Or if a person used other words in order to utter the neder. And this goes back to what I said earlier, that some of the first mishnayot that we'll see in the first sugiyot discuss kinuyei nedarim. Okay, so not the word korban itself, for example, but words like konam, konach, konas. Okay, these kinuyim were used very, very commonly, and so the Mishnah discusses how should they be considered just like a regular neder, or are there distinctions? So we can see that there's a lot of attention that's paid to the actual words that are used and making very, very clear what am I addressing when I'm taking the neder. Now, similarly, another condition is that the neder has to apply to something that's not only clear, but something that is physical. Okay, so many different problems will be addressed in the Masechet when the person who took the vow didn't make it clear enough what he was applying the prohibition to, the neder to. Okay, this is what's called matpis b'davar ha'asur, that you're applying the neder to something that is already prohibited, perhaps, or something that the neder cannot be applied to. So, for instance, a neder cannot be applied to something that is not a physical object. Okay, and here we get to a very important distinction between a neder and a shvuah. In order for a neder to apply, there must be some physical object that the neder can rest upon. Okay, and this is what's called in halachic language an isur chefza. Okay, the neder has to prohibit a certain object, or sometimes it can also be a certain person. By contrast, a shvuah is an isur gavra. It's an isur that applies to the gever, to the person. So let's think about an example that can distinguish between these two isurim. For instance, let's say that I have a fight with my neighbor, and I say, I don't want to enjoy the smell of your cooking on Friday morning anymore. So I cannot take a neder to prohibit that kind of enjoyment, because the neder only prohibits the chefza, an object, and a smell is not considered a physical object. By contrast, if I swear that, if I take an oath, a shvuah, that I won't enjoy the smells of my neighbor's cooking, then the shvuah will take effect. And that means that it's not that she has to do anything, but I will have to make sure to close my windows on Friday morning so that I don't enjoy the scent of her cooking. Okay, so a shvuah is actually accepting some kind of extra obligation. By contrast, a neder is not me accepting a personal obligation. It's actually changing something in the reality. It's saying that food is now prohibited to me, or sometimes I can also prohibit it to other people. So I'm making a difference in the item itself. Now, when we go back to the Pesukim of the Torah, and we think about where do Nedarim actually appear, they appear in chapter 30 of Bamidbar, and the Parshiah there of Nedarim actually discusses mostly the Nedarim of a woman and the possibility of the husband to annul the neder, lefer et nidrei ishto, okay, and the possibility of a father to annul the neder of his daughter. By the way, this is the reason, probably, that Masechet Nedarim appears in Seder Nashim. Okay, you might ask, what is it doing here after we talked about Ktubot and we'll talk about Gitin and Kiddushin? Seems somewhat out of place. But as we'll see, this is the original context of the of Nidarim in the Torah, and we'll see that also the end of the Masechet focuses on Nidarim of women and their relationships with their fathers and husbands. Now the pasuk there says, "Kol neder v'chol shvuat isar le'anot nefesh isha yekimenu ve'isha yeferenu." So any vow and any oath that are related to le'anot nefesh, so to induce some kind of inui nefesh, right? Some kind of suffering, similarly to the terminology that's used regarding Yom Kippur. Isha yakimenu ve'isha yefirenu. So her husband can validate the neder, and her husband can also annul the neder. Now, what emerges from this pasuk is that the husband can only annul nidarim that have to do with inui nefesh, okay, with some kind of affliction that the woman afflicts herself. So, for instance, if she says, I don't want to beautify myself, I don't want to use makeup, I'm going to take a neder that I'm not going to take a shower now for a month, etc. And interestingly, we can see that the halakha in the Mishnah refers primarily to this kind of a vow, okay, a vow which has to do with inui nefesh. However, in the Midrashei Halacha and in both of the Talmudim, a drasha is brought that uses the pasuk, the term ben ish leishto, and derives from that a husband can annul not only nedarim of inui nefesh, but anything that is dvarim shebeino leveina, meaning any kind of neder that can bring to conflict between the couple or can cause pain and anguish between the couple, which obviously expands the kinds of nedarim that the husband can annul very, very significantly. Okay. By contrast, in the Torah itself, that with regard to the nedarim that the father can annul for his daughter, it doesn't use that expression of inui nefesh. And so it seems at first blush that the father can annul any kind of his daughter's nedarim. And indeed, in the Mishnah, that's what there seems to be a distinction between the nedarim of the husband, who can only annul nedarim of inui nefesh, and the nedarim of the father, who can annul any kind of nedarim. However, again, in the Midrashei Halacha and in the Talmudim, there's a comparison made between the din of the father and the din of the husband. And what's accepted by the time we reach our sugiyot in the Talmud is that both the husband and the father can annul both nedarim of inui nefesh and nedarim shebeino leveina. So we see that in the context of the Torah and the Midrashei Halacha, a lot of the discussion about nedarim, and particularly about hafarat nedarim, emerges in the context of gender relationships, of a husband and wife, of a father and a daughter. But what about men? What about men who are not under the reshut of another man? Are they able to also annul their nedarim? So already in our earliest sources, we see that there is an idea of hafarat nedarim of a man as well, even though in the Torah we don't find this idea at all. And indeed, the famous Mishnah in Masechet Chagiga says, "Heter nedarim porchim ba'avir ve'en lahem al ma she'yismochu." The very idea of heter neder for a man is porchim ba'avir, right? It's something that's not connected to the ground, and it doesn't have anything in the text of the Torah that it can be relied on. Okay, it's more a chidush of chachamim. And indeed, if you think about the Tanakh, some of the nedarim and some of the shvuot also that were related in the Tanakh were accidental and were immediately regretted But nonetheless, it doesn't seem like there was a possibility of a heter. So if you think about the neder of Yiftach, for instance, who says that he'll sacrifice whatever will come out of his house first, which he immediately regretted when he saw his daughter come out of his house. But the Tanakh doesn't seem to think that there's an option that he could just, go to a chacham and say, I want to annul this neder, which is what we see in much of Masechet Nedarim. So how does it work exactly in rabbinic literature? We find the idea that the key to Hatarat HaNeder is the Chacham, okay? And the Chacham has to interrogate the person who wants to annul the Neder, and ask all kinds of questions in order to uncover that actually the Neder was made under circumstances that were in some way a mistake. And as soon as the Chacham manages to find that, then he can annul the Neder. Then he can say, if you didn't intend for the Neder to apply in such and such circumstances, then you can annul the Neder, and it actually never applied. So those are the most important and main ideas of the Masechet. And when we think about the structure of the Masechet, then we can see that these ideas are very much reflected in the Masechet. The first two chapters discuss the language of the Nedarim very extensively. They discuss Yadot Nedarim and Kinuyei Nedarim, which we spoke about earlier. Chapter 3 talks about the importance of the kavanah, of the intention of the neder. So we have this connection between the language itself and the intention, the dibur and the da'at. Chapters 4 and 5 discuss in isurei hana'ah, so things that a person prohibits upon themselves through a neder to enjoy something, and goes into all the details. For example, if a person took a vow not to derive benefit, not to derive enjoyment from his son, is he allowed to go to the grandson's wedding, right? Which presumably the father is making the wedding for the grandson. Is the grandfather allowed to go and enjoy himself at such a wedding? Chapter 6 distinguishes between Isurei Hana'ah and Isurei Achila, and goes into the question of food very extensively, and discusses what exactly are the parameters of a prohibited food. So for example, if I took a neder not to eat a certain kind of food, am I allowed to eat the sauce that the food was cooked in, even if I don't eat the food itself? Chapter 7 discusses terminology and the importance of being very, very precise when you take a neder. So for example, if I took a neder that I won't be able to enjoy a certain house, am I allowed to derive benefit from the attic of that house? Or is the attic a part of the house? Is it separate, or is it a part of the house? Chapter 8 discusses the time at which the neder applies. For example, if a person took a vow not to enjoy wine today, so when does the day end? Does it end at dusk? Does it end at at which hour exactly does it end? So the question of time becomes a very important one. Question of where this week, this Shabbat, this month, etc., etc. And then chapters 9, 10, and 11, which are the last third of the Masechet, go into the question of Hatarat Nedarim in depth. Chapter 9 focuses more on the Hatarat Nedarim by a Chacham, while chapters 10 and 11 really go back to the biblical text and discuss Hafarat Nedarim by a father, by a husband, or also by a fiancé. So we see here that really the main theme of the Masechet is the theme of the connection between speech and intention. What kind of speech do you have? What kind of intention? When is just the intention enough? When you perhaps said some of the words, but not all of the words? When do the words themselves take effect, even if you didn't have complete intention? And perhaps going back to what we started with, the Masechet is also reminding us that, you know, what distinguishes people from all other animals in the creation is the capacity for speech. And that we have to be very, very careful about our speech, because that is actually part of our Tselem Elohim. That's actually part of what distinguishes us and makes us capable, just like God, capable of creating something new through our speech, which is really a unique human capacity. Good luck with the Masechet, and we will meet at the next Masechet.